Hi, I'm Marc Lynch, Director of the Project on Middle East Political Science and the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. Welcome back to the POMEPS Conversations, our series of discussions with leading scholars in the field. With me today is Norma Moruzzi of the University of Illinois at Chicago. And Norma, you've written a lot about Iranian women and many of the issues that they've confronted economically, socially, culturally. And I guess a good way to start this would simply be to say, what's changed for Iranian women? We've gone through the revolution, Ahmadinejad, we're here with Rouhani now. In terms of what they're looking for politically and culturally and socially, how would you describe the views of Iranian women right now?
That's a great question, Mark, because, and yet it has in some ways, I think, a very simple answer. That what Iranian women are looking for now is the same as what women would be looking for in any modern, integrated, globally connected society, which is a good life as we would define it, right? Often a meaningful job and employment combined with satisfying home life and a family, however that might be defined. Political participation and a secure public space in which they are active. As well as a private sphere that allows them freedoms to develop themselves. So in some ways very familiar, at the same time in some ways quite constrained. The background for that, I would say, is that what I've found and how I would characterize Iranian women since the revolution is that they are legally second-class citizens. They have legally constrained rights in terms of inheritance, in terms of political participation at the highest levels, in terms of certain kinds of legal status representations as well. At the same time, they are socially extremely integrated and publicly present, both in the public sphere as a political engagement and also on the street and in public life. We see that, and that's a big change, which sometimes surprises people, that's really since the revolution. That the revolution may have minimized or restrained political rights for women with the Constitution, but the post-revolutionary legal status. But in terms of social provision and access to social provision, in terms of education, healthcare, two of the key social and cultural indicators globally that we consider for women's status worldwide, things like literacy and fertility, age of marriage, women have progressed tremendously and are in really a very different situation and a much better situation than they were before the revolution.
Let's talk about education. This is actually familiar across many Arab countries as well, where you've had an enormous growth in women's secondary and post-secondary education, but then a real blockage at the next step in terms of political leadership, finding jobs in the appropriate spheres. What's happening there with all these educated women, and as they enter into, or they try and enter into the professional space or the...
This is a really good question. I don't mean to laugh at it. It's a serious question, but we wish we knew exactly. What we do know is that we have very reliable statistics on literacy rates, that it's good to keep in mind that at the time of the revolution, not only was Iran an urban majority country. In fact, in 1979, that is the point at which Iran becomes urban majority, but it was a majority illiterate country, and with a very large gender gap between male and female literacy. So you have most people couldn't read and write, and the vast majority of women couldn't read and write. One of the things, the great accomplishments of the Islamic Republic is that they very quickly institute free required access to public education for boys and girls.
Why was that such a priority for them?
It seems that it's sort of two things. One is the real historical tendency that popular revolutions with some kind of representative mandate from the French Revolution on realized they need an informed citizenry, and that's based on education. So that's a long lineage, a couple hundred years. Worldwide we've seen that, but I think in the Iranian context it was the aspect of what we might think of as the really positive social justice aspects of the revolution, Islamic or otherwise, were about what ordinary individuals deserved from the state, and that was partly the right to an education. So boys and girls really began to be enrolled in large numbers, majority numbers, in urban and rural areas in primary school. And by now, if you look at the statistics, literacy statistics for the ages, for instance, 15 to 24, which means completion of primary school, but the post-revolutionary generation, it's 98.5 or so percent literacy, and it's a point-something% difference between men and women. So it's full literacy, essentially.
The schools continue to be gender segregated, though.
Yes, from kindergarten through secondary school are sex-segregated schools. So girls' schools, boys' schools, all the teachers in the girls' schools are women, all the teachers in the boys' schools are men. This actually seems to have been one of the reasons perhaps that the education policy was so successful, because conservative families that otherwise had resisted sending their daughters to school felt that now, in fact, were encouraged to realize that, well, they're not going to be with boys, they're not going to be mingling with strange men. You have no excuse not to send your daughter to get an education, and they did. In fact, what we've seen too with some field work is that working class Iranian families living near, for instance, Afghan refugee families will, in fact, pressure those families also to educate their girls. It's really a norm now in society. We also know from global studies that up through secondary school, girls actually tend to achieve more academically if they're in all-girls environments. Boys tend to achieve more if they're in co-educational environments. Just one of those ironies, depending if you're a parent, how you might choose. So girls have really done well academically. They are now somewhat the majority in university studies. This does lead, though, to the question which you raised about why they are underrepresented in employment. They are not as visible or present in the workforce as we would expect with such an educated and, again, integrated population.
Do they, I don't know if you have data on this, but are there any systematic patterns in their voting preferences? I mean, do these kind of educated but underemployed women represent a distinct voting bloc? Are these Rouhani's voters, or is there something else going on?
There is some gender distinction in voting patterns. It seems that there is some tendency by women to more support reform or pragmatic candidates. They recognize that often can be an issue difference, although it's not particularly significant. Breakdowns of the population it doesn't seem, from what we know, to be that significant in terms of gender distinctions in political attitude. Their women's and men's preferences politically have multiple kinds of directions through all sorts of different sources. It is true, on the other hand, that, for instance, in the 2009 election, what was very important at that point was that there was a joint platform by women's rights organizations, and I shouldn't even call them women's rights organizations in Iran, some of whom identified as secularists, some of whom identified as religious, some of whom identified as feminists, some of whom identified as activists for gender justice. And this secular religious divide in Iran is very significant culturally and politically across gender lines. This was one of the first times that those two sides, for women's issues or any other kind, were able to mobilize a joint platform of questions that they presented to the major candidates in terms of the candidates' positions on issues of interest to women.
And that was in 2009?
That was 2009. So we see that there is mobilization around women's issues, including support for families, education for children, healthcare issues, what we might also think of here as family and women's issues. But I wouldn't say that there is a strong gender pattern in voting.
I have this vague memory of Khatami having a much stronger base of support among women voters. Is that right?
I think what we saw with Khatami and with reformists is that the first time that we really saw that.
I see.
We saw that there were large segments of the population, which, if you add it all up, really did seem to possibly be the majority: women, youth, students. Lots of men as well who were not or might be students or adults.
But it's not like you've seen like a decline in women's voting for reformist candidates. You see it as pretty stable.
Yes, I would say that. Again, that is a little bit hard to know since, of course, the 2009 was so contested. But what we seem to have seen, for instance, with the Rouhani election, is that for all the divisions and regional disparities, there is a large percentage overall of the population women and men who want life to normalize internally and externally, and saw Rouhani as the best chance for that. And that's why I answered at the very beginning, I think women want what they would want anywhere, but that also means normalizing of the political sphere internally and also in external relations.
So earlier today, you were talking about the birth rate in Iran, and I found this fascinating. I don't want to steal your thunder by repeating it, so I'll let I'll let you do it. But could you just walk us through that again? You know, what has happened with fertility rate in Iran and why it matters?
Okay. Yeah, that's a really interesting pattern historically and with its present implications. So a lot of people know that in Iran had one of the highest birth rates in the world. The birth rate really was, it had declined some, but then it started rising before the revolution, actually. It really peaked shortly after the revolution, and then started falling around the time, although a little bit before, the government, the post-revolutionary government, realized that it was great to have all these new citizens of the Islamic Republic, but then with the provision for public education, healthcare, et cetera, that's a big commitment. And they really instituted the most effective family planning programs in the world. They were able to go from basically one of the highest, if not the highest, population growth rates to one of the, at the lower end, the fastest anyone's ever seen. So from over 3 points to right now it's, I think, about 1.22, which again is a remarkable drop, and they achieved that very, very quickly. So they did this by getting everyone on board with family planning, the medical professionals, clerics, religious institutions, women's groups, etc., providing family planning as part of public health care, providing sex education classes as part of required marital classes before you get a marriage license. However, what that means now is that they are suddenly facing a rapidly aging population and a falling birth rate that continues to fall, with a very constrained economic situation. And so, like many other developed countries, the government is now concerned from the opposite perspective about, are they going to have enough workers in the future to be able to support an aging population without large extended families, where people live longer but can't count on numerous children and an extensive household to support them, and yet expect the kind of services and care and health care that they might in other developed countries. So there's a lot of concern, and I think this is partly what's underneath some of the rhetoric and the sort of pro-natalist policy that's now coming out of, at least rhetorically, out of the leader's office.
And then the two things are linked, of course, as you have the education, the urbanization, entry into the workforce. In comparative terms, that's typically when you see falling birth rates.
Right.
It's unlikely this will be reversed.
That's exactly right. For all the rhetoric about having larger families, that might be that now maybe you'll have 3 instead of 2 if people listen. But this is really considered by many people inside and outside. It's sort of a laughable, it's an ideological preference or rhetorical encouragement that really is not going to have very much difference in terms of the achieved gains in, again, literacy, participation, and healthcare for women.
Well, great, thank you. This is really interesting. Norma Moruzzi of University of Illinois Chicago, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.